When- Okay. Hello and happy Groundhog Day to all who celebrate. It's a good day for stories featuring rodents that may or may not be supernatural. Although our main focus today is going to be on the rat catcher or Pied Piper. Little content warning before we begin. I'm not going to be going into any graphic detail, but many of the stories and films that I'm going to be mentioning do feature various kinds of harm to animals and or humans, as well as death or implied death. So if you decide that you want to go looking into reading or watching anything that I mention, you might want to check out the content warnings before you do that so that you are prepared. This quote on my first slide here is from the English translation of the novella Kreisar by Czech author Viktor Dick. It's my favorite of the Pied Piper adaptations that I have read, and we will be returning to it later in the talk. It is a good little introduction to the character. But most of you, if you encountered this story as a child, which is when most people first do, have probably gotten the story either through the Brothers Grimm version, or through the Robert Browning version, or through a version that is heavily based upon one or both of these. These versions are similar in that they contain the main parts of the story that we see repeated again and again in most of the adaptations. You get a colorfully dressed man who comes to the German town of Hamelin and offers to rid it of its rat infestation. He does so by playing a magical pipe. The town refuses to pay the agreed upon price after he has completed the task, and in revenge, the piper plays his pipe again, this time taking the town's children. The Grimm brothers set their version of the story in 1284. Robert Browning sets his in 1376. The Grimm version is prose, whereas Browning's version is a poem. And Browning's version is more fairy tale-like than the Grimm version, although the Grimm version does contain some features, including reference to the Pied Piper returning at the end wearing a strange red hunter's hat that give the story more of a fairy tale feel. Both versions feature a child or children who are left behind at the end. In the Grimm version, there are two children, one blind and one who is deaf and mute. In the Browning version, the child who is left behind because he limps when he walks and is unable to keep up with the other children. Both versions end with the ultimate fate of the children being left vague and a mystery, but it is mentioned that one possibility is that they were taken by the Piper to Transylvania. Now, although both of these versions feature the rats, and the Black Death is a common interpretation for the explanation behind the story, this idea that is deeply ingrained in pop culture and art and literature and film doesn't actually fit in when we look at the story in its historical context. Hamelin was a mill town, as such, would have certainly suffered when infested by rats, both due to the personal loss of plague deaths and the economic loss due to disruption of trade and damage to goods. So it makes sense that that idea would strike a chord. But the story predates the Black Death. Although it no longer exists, we know from references in manuscripts that one of the earliest depictions of the story was a stained glass window installed in one of the churches in town around the year 1300, before the Black Death, but not long after the 1284 date. And the Grimm brothers' version of the story is not the first place where that date comes up, as we will see. It is, in fact, the date most often given for the event in the earlier depictions of the story. There are several references in later texts to lost sources, and while we have no way of knowing if some of those lost sources ever truly existed, there are others that we have reason to think probably did exist, including a chorus book from around the year 1384 that belonged to Johannes de Lude, who was a dean at a church in Hamelin. And his mother was allegedly an eyewitness to the disappearance of the children. We know about this chorus book because of a later manuscript. It is probably the single most important text in Pied Piper scholarship because it is the earliest surviving written record. It is unfortunately not definitive proof of anything because it is nearly 200 years after the events supposedly took place that we get this account. But it does mention many of the important points in the story. Now, the Lüneburg manuscript contains a chronicle from about 1370 called Catena Aurea, or Golden Chain. And on the back page of this manuscript, in different handwriting from a later time period, estimated to be around 1430 to 1450, there is a description of the Pied Piper story. Here we get the 1284 date, as well as a specific reference to a day, the Feast of St. John's and Paul, which puts the story as taking place around June 26th. It's said that a young man of about 30 years old, well-dressed, comes to town, plays his pipe, and lures the children away to the east. And thereafter, they vanish, and despite attempts to find them, can never be found again. And the town, particularly the mothers, mourn their loss. This version also makes reference to Dean Lude and his mother eyewitnessing the event. Although, as mentioned before, that text is lost, it is known from other sources that Dean Lude was a real person who lived in Hamelin and lived at a time when his mother could conceivably have been alive to witness an event happening in 1284. However, as you may have noticed, there are no rats mentioned in this version. At this time, the most common interpretation of the events of the Pied Piper story was not that he was a rat catcher there to relieve the town of plague-carrying rats. Instead, the Piper was seen as a representative of the devil or as the devil himself, as is the case in this account from the mid-16th century. The story was treated as being true at this time, and this and other references to it often make note that town records and town officials and clergymen were spoken to as a verification of the story's truth. However, the details are becoming murky. So this story is 180 years ago on St. Mary Magdalene's Day instead of the 300 almost years ago and St. John and Paul's feast day. We don't know when the rats enter the oral tradition, but the first known mention of rats is in a family chronicle written by Count von Zimmern from the mid-16th century. Despite the alterations to the story that were happening, the spread of the story through oral tradition did also help preserve some of the original details of the story, as is the case with the aforementioned window. The stained glass window was installed around 1300 and had fallen in disrepair and was mended in around 1572. In 1592, a man named Augustin von Morsberg, who had heard about the story of the Pied Piper and was interested in it, came to Hamelin to learn more about the story. And while he was in Hamelin, in addition to talking to town officials and clergymen and consulting various town documents, he decided to have a watercolor rendition of the stained glass window made, which is the painting that you see on this slide. We don't know exactly how faithful this interpretation is, but it does match some of the other descriptions that we have, in that you see the piper as a large figure. Most of the descriptions of the window describe him as being surrounded by smaller figures, who are usually interpreted as being children. However, due to the conventions of medieval art at the time, it might be that the size difference between the piper and the other figures represents not an adult and children, but the most important figure in the story and somewhat lesser important figures in the story. The inscription was one of the parts of the window that had suffered from damage and become garbled, but the general gist gives us the 1284 date that aligns with the other records, and the gist of the piper luring away the children out of town and them never being seen again. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Morsberg for ensuring that the window wasn't as completely lost to history as it could have been. The town of Hamelin took great pride in its story at this time. The fact that it helped bring visitors from out of town was part of that. And also the story's role in teaching morality lessons made it useful in church services for warning people about the perils of the devil. And this pride that Hamelin had in the story is reflected in the architecture throughout the town. The earliest example of this is the town gate, and this stone is called the Newgate Stone because it was built new in the 16th century. The lower part, added in 1556, repeats the basic story of the piper figure stealing away the children from the city. Again, this is a reflection of some uncertainty about the date of the story. The Stone gives it as being placed 272 years after the time of the story, which does not quite align with the 1284 date, and we will come back to that later. Later in the 16th century, we have the rat catcher's house, so-called because of the inscription on the house, which again gives the 1284 date and the Saints John and Paul feast, putting the story at June 26th. The children from Hamelin who are led away by the piper dressed in colorful clothing, and they go away. Here the location is given as Calvary and are lost. The house is older than the stone facade. It is unknown whether there was an older inscription that was replaced when the new facade was put on. It's also unknown whether there was an inscription similar on a pre-existing building before this one was built. Similarly, the wedding house features an inscription. Here, instead of cavalry, we have the place that they go to listed as Koppen. And again, we have similar language in the inscription. It is believed that the similarity in the language in the inscriptions is an echo of an older rhyme that was known throughout the town and possibly inscribed on older buildings before it was re-inscribed on the newer buildings that were being built at this time. In the 17th century, the pride in the story and the firm belief that it was a true story began to be challenged. Some of the residents, even within the city of Hamelin, began to feel some embarrassment about being associated with a story that they believed to be a fable rather than a truth. And so in 1653, we had the dismissal of the story by Burgomaster Gerhard Reich. This then led to a counter-defense for the story by Pastor Samuel Eric, who actually wrote a book defending the story's truth. Although we can credit Eric with being perhaps the first in person to look at the story and try to investigate the truth of it, he wasn't really trying to determine historical truth. He was still focused on the idea of the piper as the devil, and his argument is that the story is a true account of the devil appearing in Hamelin. And so that didn't sit well with people who didn't like the fable aspects of the story. Senator Sebastian Spilker wrote a rather lengthy treatise detailing why he thought the story was not true, including reference to the fact that the documents that they had were not from the time period when the story is supposed to have taken place. There was also a Dutch scholar named Martin Schuck who published a book called Fabula Hamelensis, and his book was a direct refutation of Eric's book, arguing against the idea that there was any truth in the Pied Piper story. He caused there to be a different kind of interest in the Piper story, and instead of the repetition of the story merely in churches as a morality tale, you also began to see the story being repeated over and over again at universities, where it became a popular debate topic for students: true or not true, the Pied Piper. And a little bit later than this was when that stained glass window was removed from the church and ultimately destroyed. How much that was due to changing opinions in the town about the story itself, and how much that was due to the struggle to maintain the window is unclear. There's no record of the precise reasoning for the removal of the window. So, what really happened? The Black Death, or at least the rats, remain a popular motif in fictional portrayals of the story, but aside from occasional speculation about maybe there was an earlier rat infestation and disease epidemic similar to the Black Death that wasn't the Black Death, this isn't really considered a likely explanation for the story due to the lack of support for any link between the Piper and the rats in records from the time and early accounts of the tale. Other theories for what could be behind the story feature a wide range of explanations rooted in events of the century. Um, because of the Piper demagogue figure, he has often been linked to other known charismatic demagogue figures of the time period. This has led to some historians suggesting that the story represents either a memory of the Children's Crusade, and one of the Children's Crusade events did take place in Germany, led by a figure named Nicholas. However, in the accounts of Nicholas and the Children's Crusade, he is not depicted in language similar to the Pied Piper, and that there is no convincing explanation for why the date would suddenly be changed from 1212 to 1284 in the storytelling. So that theory has never gained firm support from a large consensus of historians. Similarly, with association between the Piper and the false Holy Roman Emperor impostor who appeared in 1284, beyond the link between the coincidence of the date and geography and charisma, there is not any evidence in historical records to support the equation with the Piper and Tilculp. So that's a theory that has not gained widespread currency. There are other theories that are again rooted in the story itself. So the dancing language often used to describe the way that the children follow the Piper is sometimes used to link the story to incidents of choreomania or St. Vitus's dance, which there is a 13th century incidence of this that is recorded. Again, the dates don't line up with the most commonly given date for the Pied Piper story. Some historians will say that it could have been another lesser known epidemic rather than a attempt to tell of the specific known one. Similarly, the references in the story to cavalry, or more specifically, the references to Kopen or Kopel or Koppenberg Hill, depending on the exact version, are sometimes used to link the story to landscape, and some historians have suggested that a natural disaster, such as a landslide or a sinkhole, could have been responsible for the disappearance of the children. There is nothing to prove or disprove this, because if it was something like a natural disaster, or a lesser known outbreak of the dancing plague. Well, the Pied Piper story is the only record of that in those cases, and so we would never know. Another theory is that the Piper led not literal children, but figurative children, the children of Hamelin, people who were born in Hamelin and were young people, uh, into battle. And this theory is based largely upon that Newgate stone that I mentioned earlier. Because if you go off of the date given by the Newgate stone, that lines up pretty closely with the 1260 date known for the Battle of Sedemünder, which happened between the village of Minden, or the town of Minden, and people from around the town of Hamelin. According to this theory, the young people who went off to the battle died, and that was the reason for this disappearance. The problem with this theory is that it hinges so much on that stone, which wasn't placed until much, much later than the time of event, and we get the 1284 date before the date on that stone. And it's possible that the reason for the date on that stone is not because it's preserving an older tradition, but because of either a mistake or that there was already a theory by perhaps earlier skeptics trying to link to a historical date, and they put the date on the stone because they were thinking of the battle, not because they knew that that was the date. But this idea that perhaps it was not literal children, but figuratively the children of Hamelin who disappeared is important for the theory that has now become the most widely accepted, and that is the migration colonization theory. We see hints that could be used to support this theory early in the language describing the children as heading out of town and heading eastward. And there are references in some of the manuscripts to the idea that the children wound up in Transylvania. One example of that is in this account by Richard Verstegen. This account is notable, firstly, because it is the first English language version of the story. Secondly, because it is the first version of the story known where the actual phrase Pied Piper is used, although he is described as being dressed colorfully before then, so that idea is there, even though the exact phrase is not there earlier. It's also known to be one of the sources that Robert Browning likely consulted when he was writing his poem. So uh, it's a very influential piece, and it contains this reference, which Verstegen laughs off, to the idea of the children winding up in Transylvania. Now, it is a historical fact that there was German migration to Transylvania and colonies there. However, it was also common in English and German language literary traditions to treat Transylvania as a fictional sort of fairy tale place. And there's been good work done on that by Christina Diamant, who did a talk for Romancing the Gothic a few years ago and also by Sam George, and those are both referenced in my works cited at the end of this PowerPoint, so you can get those details if you are interested in reading further about that idea. Um, Verstegen laughs off the idea because he says that if a bunch of strange children mysteriously showed up in Transylvania, surely the people who were living there would have been struck by the strangeness of these mysterious children showing up, and there would be a record of it from that end. He is thinking of the children as literal children when he laughs it off like this, but it would be a lot less shocking if it was young adults who migrated to a new place as part of official efforts by authorities in the region to create settlements in the area. And Transylvania is not the only place where historically this happened. There were also efforts to establish German colonies in Moravia and Silesia and other Slavic regions. In the late 18th or late 19th and early 20th century, some of the historians doing work on Piper scholarship began to find evidence possibly linking the story to this idea of colonization and migration. To begin with, there was work by Heinrich Spanuth, who was pursuing references by the philosopher Leibniz to the idea that there was a manuscript referencing the Piper story in the town of Lüneburg. He was told by the officials there that no such manuscript existed, but he went there and dug through everything that he could find, and he found that little handwritten version of the story written on that other manuscript that I shared with you earlier. And he realized, based on the time period of the manuscript and the date given in the manuscript, that there wasn't as much support for the then widely believed theory of the Battle of Sedemünder being the inspiration, and began to look in interest at other possible explanations. At the same time period, there was a archivist from the town of Tropal, now Ostrava, in what is now the Czech Republic, who had noticed that there were place names and surnames in his region that contained roots suggesting a link to Hamelin, as well as similar surnames to people who had lived in Hamelin in the 13th century. And based on this, and based on knowledge of a prominent bishop at the time period who was known to have been instrumental in efforts to bring German settlers to colonize Moravia and Silesia, and who had originally come from a castle on the Weser River, Weser being the same river that the town of Hamelin is located on. He argued that it was this migration event that lay behind the story. In the known records of the migration and colonization, there are figures called locators who are said to have been colorfully dressed and traveled from town to town, charming the residents of the town, specifically the younger adults who did not own land and could not inherit land due to the laws of the time period, to come to Moravia or Silesia or wherever and get the land available there. So, based on Wolfgang Von's work, Spanoth really helped to promote this idea that the migration was the root of the Pied Piper story. Other scholars since then have also built on this idea, suggesting other places that the Pied Piper might have taken the children to instead of the Moravia Silesia region, Poland being the most common place, but it's still specifically usually Silesian regions of Poland, so that Slavic link remains. However, outside of scholarship, the migration, colonization interpretation of events pretty much never comes up. Fiction and pop culture remain very much rooted in the influence of the Grimm brothers and Robert Browning and the idea of the piper as the rat catcher. Um, and so we see those motifs that I originally mentioned are the ones that tend to get repeated. In Goethe's poem, the Pied Piper is depicted very much as a charismatic figure, and the poem focuses far more on his charisma than on other elements of the story. However, there is, due to the references to the Pied Piper in Faust, also that link to the idea of the Pied Piper's association with the devil that remains a part of literary tradition. If you want a very classic adaptation of the Pied Piper story, the 1972 film directed by Jacques Demy and featuring the folk singer Donovan in the Pied Piper role, is a very good go-to. It is set in the Middle Ages, very, very focused on the rats and plague epidemic aspects of the story. But it also is very strongly characterized by the idea that the authorities who run the town of Hamelin, the institutions that run life in the town of Hamelin, have absolutely failed at protecting the vulnerable people from this epidemic. And the Pied Piper, in this case, is presented not as a demonic figure, but a more gray, fairy, fae-like figure, who is there not to punish the children on behalf of their parents, but to punish the adults and to remove the children from coming to further harm under the influence of those corrupt adults. In more strictly horror-focused adaptations, the idea of the Piper as the devil figure persists, even in cases when he is given something of a justification for his actions. So the Piper, which came out in 2023, starring Charlotte Hope, does make reference to the original story and the Piper getting revenge after the townspeople fail to fulfill their end of the bargain. However, despite passing reference to this, it focuses far more on the Piper as a malevolent source set to disrupt and cause harm, and it makes a lot of references to the music and somewhat uh, semi-historically accurate ideas of medieval musical theory about harmony and discord in the service of that. The music is often focused on as a source of the atmosphere and the dread and fear felt by characters in the story, as in the case in this 1950s short story, which is um, more focused on the disparity between the characters, the children who can hear the music, and the adults who cannot. Um, Again, however, the Piper is given a backstory that hints at a small amount of justification for his actions, and it implies that because the Piper is this evil figure, um, his retribution is entirely out of proportion to the actual harm done. In the 2015 Korean adaptation of The Piper, the story has moved to taking place shortly after the Korean War. Here, the Piper is presented far more sympathetically. The familiar elements of the story with the town's betrayal remain a part of the tale, um, and it is a sad story, and the Piper's revenge is ultimately rather brutal, but it is built up to as a accumulation of tragedies and portrayals, um, and the Piper figure's malevolence at the end is tempered by this very human uh, story that he is given leading up to those events. And a lot of the versions that have come out in more recent times do, whether they present the Piper as a straightforward villain or a more gray area character or even a somewhat heroic figure, focus on these complicated motivations and shift a lot of the blame back onto the townspeople, the authority figures, the institutions that fail and betray. In Cynthia Palaio's Children of Chicago, the horrors of the story are grounded in gang violence and serial murder. In Max Turner's The Child of Hamelin, the focus is on a child who is left behind and the feelings of abandonment and isolation that he feels when the other children are all taken and he is not. And it also deals with issues of child abuse and neglect. Um, all of these elements are really wrapped up and present in the novella that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Kreisar by Victor Dick, and the stop motion adaptation of it, not the stop motion adaptation does change some of the details of the story, but the spirit of it is very much still there. Like the Donovan version, the Piper is very much a gray area character. Like the Korean adaptation, he is presented in a very humanizing way, despite the references to his supernatural abilities. He's actually in a romantic relationship in this version of the story. And while the failures of the townspeople, particularly in the novella, are of a more mundane kind of disappointment and failure and betrayal than in the Paleo and Turner versions of the story. It is still ultimately a factor in the Piper's ultimate revenge. However, in this case, it's not so much that he is avenging the wrong done to himself, but rather the wrong done to the woman with whom he is having a romantic relationship. To conclude the talk, I will leave you with this quote from Harlan Ellison's Emissary of Hamelin. This version is set in the future, 2076, and here the Pied Piper is presented as an alien who comes to the town, comes to Earth to warn the people that if they do not stop doing the things they are doing to make Earth a bad place, the place will be taken away from them. Really emphasizing this idea that the story is extraordinarily adaptable. Different storytellers relate to different characters in the story, some to the Piper, some to the parents grieving the loss of their children, some to the children who often get left behind at the end of the story. And the universal themes of abandonment and isolation, of loss and grief, of betrayal, of trying to find a way to make sense of a terrible thing that is happening or has happened, really keep the story alive and perpetuated. And we will continue to dig into the story and try to make sense of it, no doubt, for years and years to come. So, list of references for you to check out, additional references for you to check out, and a little bonus Pied Piper from an abandoned amusement park in Western Pennsylvania. Thank you all very much.